Hi, I'm White Davy from White Davy Garden and Worm Farm. Today I will be showing you how to start a worm bin. Now there are many different types of worm bin that you can use, and I use many different types. Today I will be using this bucket to start my worm bin. I use different types of worm bin depending on where I'm at in my worm farm stage. So for example, if you look on the shelves there, you'll see that I have different type of bins. So those small ones down there, they're all experimental trays, and above that, where you cannot see on the shelf, I have these bins, and these are my breeding bins. So those are used just for the worms to produce cocoons, and then after producing cocoons, I'll put them in buckets, and from the buckets I'll move them to the trays. That's their final home until they're sold. So before I go and get started, I want to show you that for my worm bins, they have holes in them for aeration, but I put screens over them to ensure that fruit flies cannot get in. And I do the same thing for the cover. It has the mesh on it. Now, as you are starting your worm bin, depending on the type of bin that you use, if you're purchasing worm bins, for example, the stackable system or other types of worm bin, these will come with their holes in them. But if you're making your own, then you're going to have to put the holes in there yourself and choose whether or not you're going to be putting screens on it. If you're not using screens, then you can just use a piece of cloth, old t-shirt or whatever the case may be, and cover over the buckets and the holes and make sure that it is fit tight so that the fruit flies cannot get in. Now, most people put holes in the bottom of their worm bin. I don't use holes in my worm bin, but if you are a beginner and you have doubts as to whether you can control the amount of moisture that is in your bin, then I would recommend that you do put holes in the bottom of your bin. If you are going to put holes in the bottom of your bin, then I suggest that you have another bucket or a catchment tray that you put the worm bin in, and that is going to catch any excess moisture that is going to be draining from the worm bin. Now, some food scraps produce lots of moisture, some doesn't. So depending on what you're feeding your worms, how much bedding you have in your worm bin, these are going to determine how much moisture is going to be draining off. So in this bucket here, this is the food scraps that I'm going to be giving them some of, not all of it. And in here, I have my bedding, and this is shredded paper and shredded cardboard that I moistened a few days ago because I want to start inoculating the bin, meaning that by wetting it, I am allowing it to break down a little bit faster and producing microbes, which makes it easier for the worms to consume. Now, it is recommended that you don't use papers that contains ink. Now, there's an exception to that rule, because in some cases, depending on where you're located, some regions do not use Hink that contains lead, and it is the lead that is in the Hink that is the big problem to your worm bin. So if you want to use paper that has Hink on it, I'd strongly recommend that you find out if in your locale they use ink that is lead free. Excuse me. Now in here, I have leaves, dried leaves that are breaking down, and it is also mixed with finished compost. So I'm going to add this. I should have moistened this too. Very dusty. So I've added my compost and my dried leaves, and now I'm going to be adding the shredded cardboard. I do use my newspaper with Hink on them because in my region the Hink that they use is lead free. So I'm just going to mix this in. Now I want to show you how much moisture should be in your worm bin. Now it is said that the amount of moisture in your worm bin should be just like a wrung out sponge. So when you get a wrung out sponge, it will feel wet, but when you squeeze it, I want you to look carefully. When you squeeze it, a few drops are supposed to come out, but you don't want to see so much water coming out that it is running. So when you see a few drops running out, then you know that you have enough moisture in there. But if it is runny and not just a few drops, then you know your bin is too wet and you need to add more absorbent material to control the moisture. Next, I'm going to add the food scraps. You don't want dairy and meat in your worm bin. It is recommended that you don't feed them acidic food, but they do eat acidic food in small quantities. If you use too much, then that is where it can become harmful to your worm bin. Next, you want to bury your food scraps. And the reason you're burying your food scraps is because it is less likely to attract pests like fruit flies, and if you're having your bin outdoors, rodents and other creatures like those. So now I've moistened the bin, I've added the bedding, and I like to use shredded leaves with my shredded paper because shredded paper tends to compact. Shredded cardboard, no, not so much, but the shredded paper, if you're using just shredded paper, it will compact. So I like to add the dried leaves in between because that will keep it nice and fluffy, which is going to encourage good airflow in the worm bin. Now these are my worms. I'm not going to be putting this particular set of worms in here. I have a pound of worm in here, but this I am getting ready for an order, so these are not going to be going in here. I'm putting hatchlings in here, but the hatchlings are so small that you won't be able to see them, which is why I'm showing you those worms. So this is one of my cocoon bins, and the worms in here, the cocoons in here have hatched. So now I'm just transferring them over. You may choose to or not to wear a glove when handling worms. If you're afraid of worms, or if you're concerned about the content of the bin getting underneath your nail, then I would recommend wearing your gloves. Let me see if I can get you a little close-up of this little baby worm here. Can you see him? Now, one of the things I hate about transferring baby worms, they're just so tiny. There are quite a few of them that tends to get left back into the bin. So when this happens, I just add a little moisture and wash out the bin into the container. And if I think doing so is going to make my bin too moist, then I'll just add a little bit more bedding. Try to be as gentle as I can with them. For me personally, I like to keep my worm bin full. When I keep my worm bin full, it means I don't have to feed them regularly. And if any emergency and I didn't get to look after them for a week or two, I don't have to worry, they have enough food. And by keeping the bin not too dry, like I said again, if there's an emergency and you didn't get to look after them for a week, then they won't die off. So you can have less moisture content than a wrung out sponge, but the ideal amount of moisture is that of a wrung out sponge. So now that we've added our worms, I'm just going to cover this. So that is how you create a worm bin. You can choose whatever type of worm bin you like, because they all work. Now, you might wonder what type of material you can use for bedding. There are many options for bedding, and if you're interested in seeing the various type of beddings that you can use for your worm bin, then join me on my YouTube channel, White Davy Garden and Worm Farm, next week Wednesday, March the 16th, where I'll be doing a video on the various types of bedding that you can use in your worm bin. Also, if you are interested in seeing how airflow affects your worms, the productivity of your worm bin, then you can click on the link that I'm going to be leaving in the description below. So if you enjoy this video and you'd like to see more updates on how these and other worm bins are doing, please take a moment to give me a thumbs up. You can leave a comment in the section below. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and turn on your notification for more updates like these. Thank you so much for watching and have yourself a wonderful day. Yeah man, a time for grow.